right. Hello, everyone. If you're out there watching, my name is Sara Wolk. I'm the executive director of the Equal Vote Coalition, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit dedicated to fighting for true equality in the vote itself. Our mission is really outlined by our criteria. There's kind of 5 pillars for what does equality in the vote really look like? What's the recipe? And we define that as simple. You want the voting method to be simple enough that people can do it, they can explain it, they can facilitate it, they can audit it. And you want it to be expressive. You want to be able to express your opinion as a voter. Who do I prefer to who? How much or how little do I like the candidates? The third one, and one of the most important ones, is accuracy. Is the voting method accurate? Are we getting representative results? Is the system imposing implicit bias? Are some types of candidates or some types of voters put at a disadvantage? Fourth, we've got honesty. So that means, as a voter, am I free to vote my conscience? Should I be thinking about who can win, who's electable, or is it safe to vote for somebody who might be an underdog? Do I have to worry about throwing away my vote? And finally, last but not least, we are the Equal Vote Coalition. There's an equality criterion, and that means that an equal vote, one person, one vote, means that my vote is just as powerful as your vote, no matter who I like, how many candidates are on my side, where I live, who I am, what party I belong to or lack thereof. So that's our mandate. The Equal Vote Coalition is pretty dedicated to voting methods that pass, that do well on those criteria in general. But one in particular really stands out, and that is STAR voting. So I've actually got some slides pulled up for you all, and I'm going to get into that. We'll start at the beginning and go from there. Just 1 second, let me open this in a new video, new window. Weird, it's not pulling up. All right. So as you all know, we have what's known as the two-party system. What a two-party system means, we've got good versus evil, us against them. You have to vote for one side or the other, or else face serious consequences as a voter. And what a lot of people don't put together is that we have a two-party system because we have a voting method that only produces accurate representative results if there's 2 candidates in the race. So many of us are, again, forced to vote evil, lesser evil, or favorite. If you don't think your favorite can win, you may well want to vote strategically. This all comes back to a key concept called the spoiler effect, otherwise known as vote splitting. But the way it works is if there's 2 candidates, you've got a fair election. The majority wins. People are represented fairly as possible for a single winner election. But as soon as you have a couple of good guys, you can end up splitting the vote. Voters need to strategically come together around the candidate on their side that they think can win. So that might be the more popular candidate, the more famous candidate, the more the incumbent in most cases. And really, it's which candidate is deemed more electable. Unfortunately, who is deemed electable isn't necessarily something that's based on the candidates themselves. It's often based on incumbency. Incumbents have a huge electability advantage, and it's based on the media. But in general, who's deemed to be electable, who's the incumbent, these are generally older, whiter, more financially wealthy type people. And that's just the way it has always been. In order to change equity in terms of elections, we need to level the playing field and not have it say whoever's been here the longest has the advantage. So in our current system, choose one only plurality voting, otherwise known as first past the post, if you have one candidate on your side, you're a fully powerful voter, you're good. But if you have two candidates on your side, especially if the voters aren't coming together and voting as a strategic bloc, then your vote is half as powerful. If you have three candidates on your side, your vote may be a third as powerful. And we know that because if I was to vote one way and you were on the other side and you wanted to vote equal and opposite, it would take three of you, if you spread your vote across those three candidates, to bring the election back to tied. So that's how we measure the equal vote. Ideally, a voting method should be able to be tied, have me vote, and then have you vote and bring it back to tied. So I see some participants. I'm just gonna double check the chat and make sure I'm not missing anything here. Hard to have it all pulled up. Great, yeah, it looks like a few of you are here. It looks like Sass is here.
Yes, hi Sarah. I will, sorry if that speaks a little feedback. Yeah, so I'm Sass. I've been working with Sarah and some of the members at MPP to help organize this. If you have questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, or make sure you switch to panelists and attendees if you have something you want to throw in the chat. But Sarah, I will manage that for you, so you don't have to worry about it. I'll let you focus on the presentation, and then at the end we can do some Q&A.
Awesome.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I'll just get back to it. So that's the problem. We have a choose one only voting method, and we are proposing a better voting method that allows you to show who you prefer to who and vote your conscience. So STAR voting is known as score then automatic runoff, and that's exactly how it works. Ballots are counted in 2 rounds. So you've got, you score your candidates from 0 up to 5 stars. That's the scoring round. You can show who you prefer to who. You can show how little or how much you like the various candidates. You can leave people blank. If you don't like them or you don't know about them, you don't have to vote for everybody. But it is a good idea to give your worst candidates, maybe Darth Vader, I don't know, a 0. Give your favorites 5 stars, and then arrange the others in order of preference. And the reason for that is because of the way the votes are actually counted. So the 2 highest scoring candidates overall are finalists. In this case, it's Carmen and Ben. They're the highest scoring candidates over here on the left. And then each ballot is looked at a second time. And if you preferred Carmen, she'll get your vote. If you preferred Ben, he'll get your vote. And yeah, so the candidate who is preferred by more voters wins. The finalist who's preferred overall or preferred by a majority wins. So one of the advantages with STAR voting is you get really familiar sort of results. You're able to see, you know, the electorate preferred Carmen over Ben, 58% to 41. Some voters may well have given them both 5 stars if they're both similar candidates, or they might have said, I don't like either, 2 sides of the same coin. So if you don't vote for either finalist, that's a vote of no preference between those two, but your vote still helped either prevent both of them from winning or help both of them for winning, to win, or somewhere in between. And what's amazing about this, you've got a 5-star rating, and then you get really fantastic, representative, fair outcomes. So the whole idea behind star voting, the idea that inspired me personally to get involved with star voting, is that the voting system should allow you to vote your conscience. It should accurately reflect the will of the voters, and no vote should be wasted in the process. So collecting good data, using that data, providing good results. Let's see. So for a lot of you watching this, you've probably heard about a few different voting methods. Star voting is not the only alternative voting method. I found out about ranked choice voting first, and I was really excited when I first heard about it. So star voting, you score the candidates 0 through 5 stars. 5 stars is the best. In ranked choice voting, you rank the candidates. So first choice, second choice, third choice. So both of those are pretty familiar from a user perspective. Rating and ranking, scoring versus ranking, are pretty intuitive, especially if you have a smaller field of candidates. But the difference is how they're counted. So let's see here. So for ranked choice voting, otherwise known as instant runoff voting, the way that it's counted is you add up all the first choice votes, you eliminate the candidate who came in last place, and then all the voters who preferred that candidate will have their next choice counted. Then you count all the first top remaining candidates for everyone, figure out who came in last place, and eliminate that candidate. So tournament style elimination rounds. And this is more in depth than most people usually go when they're explaining how instant runoff ranked choice works. But the devil's in the details with this method, because what can happen is that your second choice could be eliminated before your first choice, and your third choice could be eliminated before your first choice. So if you are a voter like that, let's say my favorite is a strong underdog, but these other candidates that aren't really viable are still better than the other candidate. What can happen is my third choice is eliminated, my second choice is eliminated, and then my first choice is eliminated, but my vote has nowhere to transfer to because my other choices are gone already. So that is a fundamental issue where voters who prefer a strong underdog are at a strong disadvantage. If I like a third-party candidate like a Ralph Nader who isn't viable, I probably knew that they weren't going to win going into the election, but I wanted to vote for them anyway, then ranked choice voting works great. It solves those like non-viable spoilers, the spoiler effect problem in that scenario. But if Ralph Nader all of a sudden has a populist movement behind him, and we're using a new voting system so we don't feel like we're limited by this two-party dynamic, people are actually willing to vote their conscience and risk it, what you can have is a bit of a glass ceiling where third parties are allowed to grow, and as long as they stay within that non-viable, as long as they stay below that non-viable threshold, those voters are always going to have their vote transfer, their vote counted, and their vote making a difference in that deciding round. But as soon as that candidate reaches a certain threshold where they're almost on par with the others, what can happen is that third spoiler candidate ends up staying in the race until the final round. Those voters' votes never transfer, In fact, they should have voted lesser evil for a candidate who, they should have voted lesser evil for a candidate that they knew could win, because really the way it breaks down is that instant runoff voting is just a series of choose one plurality elections, one after another. So you can still have vote splitting in any round, just like you would have vote splitting in the current system. So that might have been a lot to unpack. Do we have any questions, like clarifying questions from people at this stage?
None have come in so far.
All right. So here's a graphic that kind of illustrates it. You eliminated my first choice, but you never counted the rest of my rankings. Hey, you're throwing my vote away. For a lot of us, for me in particular, when I found out about ranked choice voting, the talking point that really resonated was, I don't have to feel like I'm throwing away my vote if I want to vote my conscience. And I personally was a little bit disillusioned when I realized that that claim didn't fully fact check. So what I did is I got involved with my local movement, and we had decided to like launch a ballot initiative. We wanted to do voting reform. We wanted to tackle this issue. But as soon as we actually got together in the room, we realized we didn't have consensus. There was a number of people who liked ranked choice voting. There were a number of people who liked approval voting, which lets you, the ballot looks the same as our current ballot, but you can approve more candidates, as many candidates as you like. Some people like score voting, where you score the candidates 0 to 5 stars, and the highest scoring candidate wins. And one person was presenting a new voting method, which was a hybrid of score voting and ranked choice. And that method turned out to be star voting. So on the one side, we had the ranked choice people who were like, hey, I really want a voting method that lets me show my preference order, and that's going to empower me to be a more honest voter. On the other side, we had the score and approval voting people, and they were saying, we want to have elections that are tabulated just using basic addition. We don't like this tournament style elimination algebra. It's not transparent, it's not auditable. It has wonky issues in terms of election integrity with precinct summability, and compatibility with risk limiting audits. So, and both sides really felt like their priorities were fundamentally important and that they weren't something that could be compromised on. So star voting as a hybrid of a scoring ballot in the first round, and then looking at your preference order, like ranked choice, in an instant runoff to determine who gets your vote ultimately, that ended up being the best of both worlds. And it really did end up delivering on the goals of both sides of the discussion. So a few of our criteria that I think are not criteria, but points that we want in a voting method are to eliminate spoiler effect and vote splitting. And our current system's awful. Ranked choice voting is better. So in fact, all alternative voting methods are better than our current system on pretty much almost every metric. And definitely overall, if the question is, should we stick with the status quo or should we do something better? Election scientists are in complete consensus that the current system is the bottom of the barrel. And they've been in consensus about that for hundreds of years. Shocking, I know. But yeah, so ranked choice mitigates that spoiler effect. Like I said, it solves it if the third party candidate isn't viable, but there still can be vote splitting. Whereas the cardinal methods, the scoring and approval voting methods and star voting fully eliminate vote splitting and guarantee an equally weighted vote at the same time. So another thing we looked at is, do voting methods give an advantage to some types of candidates? And most voting methods do. So our current system, for example, because of vote splitting, again, will take the faction with the least candidates, that faction's got an advantage. But if there are two candidates on the same side, it's gonna take the candidate who's the most polarizing, who's the most different from the rest of the field, and whoever's most different, whoever's most polarizing, often will get that advantage. Yeah, and we saw that play out in recent elections. So in the Republican primary, 2016, for those of you that can remember back that far, there was a big field of Republicans with a bunch of similar sort of establishment conservative type candidates. And then there was one outsider, Donald Trump, who really had a different message, an anti-establishment message. And what we saw is that a lot of the establishment Republicans kind of split the vote of the Republican majority, and that allowed Trump, with only about a third of the people on his side originally, to win the primary. Something similar, a bit different, happened in the Democratic primary of 2020, where we had, again, a huge field of candidates. Elections with like 15, 20 candidates are just kind of a guaranteed train wreck with choose one only voting. So we had, interestingly, in the Democratic primary, a bunch of pretty progressive candidates. We had a bunch of people of color. We had a bunch of people talking about pretty revolutionary talking points compared to what the party had proposed in the past. And then we had one candidate, Joe Biden, who was like, nothing will fundamentally change. I am the beacon of stability and, you know, nostalgia, harkening back to like when things were better and more stable. And that was different than what the rest of the pack was promising. Everyone else was promising change. So Joe Biden actually benefited from vote splitting among all those other candidates and ended up winning the election. Biden also had that electability advantage. Trump also had that name recognition. So both of them had that electability thing in their favor. But yeah, that's our current system. You already know what's wrong with that. Ranked choice voting, like I said, gives strong underdog candidates, puts strong underdogs at a disadvantage. And when it does have vote splitting and spoilers, it tends to pick the candidate that's more on the outside, the different candidate again. So that can be the more polarizing candidate. Some third-party advocates will say, hey, that actually helps us because we are the outsider in this case. But it's important to realize that that bias isn't necessarily whoever's on the edge of the political spectrum. It's just who's on the outside of the field of candidates. So it's relative to the candidates, not the voters. Approval voting has the opposite effect. And that is that if I think that my favorite maybe can't win, I should probably also approve my lesser evil. And I can't show which of those I prefer to who. So approval has a slight, not as strong as the ranked choice or choose one, but a slight bias in favor of who's more viable. Score voting, a little bit less so, but similar. And then star voting actually falls like right in the middle, where it's not favoring polarizing candidates, it's not favoring those in the middle. And that I think is really important. So another big point of difference between these different voting methods is wasted votes and exhausted ballots. So in our current system, we hear this narrative all the time of a wasted vote, like, don't waste your vote on Jill Stein, vote for Joe Biden. And so what can happen there is our vote isn't actually like helping the eventual winner. So we're not being as powerful with our vote as we would like, but it's not like we're forfeiting our vote. We're not actually voting for Donald Trump if we vote for Jill Stein. That is something that actually can happen in ranked choice voting. And it's a criterion called monotonicity, where counterintuitively voting for someone can actually hurt them and make them less likely to win. And again, that happens because not all the data is counted in ranked choice voting. Some of the rankings might be counted, some of them might not be, depending on the order of elimination. In approval voting, if you don't vote for any of the front runners, you're really not having a difference between, or making a difference on who wins. Whereas with score voting, even if you said, I don't like any of those front runners, but I'm gonna give 1 star to Biden and 0 to Trump or vice versa, you're still showing a preference. So your vote is making some difference there, even if you're in a minority faction. What is the game changer with star voting is that in that same scenario, if you didn't like any of the front runners and you gave the finalists 1 star and 0 stars respectively, with star voting, the runoff is binary. It works like it works much like a top 2 general election, but you don't have to vote again. So your full 1 vote, your entire ballot, goes to the finalist that you preferred ultimately. So you're able to weigh in on these candidates that may not be able to win, and then you're able to have a fully powerful vote in the deciding round. And I see that a question might have come in.
Yeah, I didn't want to throw you, derail you. It's a little different. The question is from Mark Roloff. I'm just going to say, Mark, do you have to win with a certain percentage of the vote in either star or RCV?
Yeah, sort of. So both star voting and ranked choice voting are kind of like majoritarian voting methods where the majority wins. But majority in election science is a bit more nebulous than we might like to think it is. So the example I like to give there is that a majority might not exist. You might have 1 blue faction, 1 purple faction, and 1 yellow faction, no overlap, everyone hates each other, and there just is no majority coalition. Alternately, and more commonly, you may have a couple of different possible majority coalitions. So when I have a large group that I'm presenting to, I'll often say, like, how many people like tacos? All the hands go up. Now, how many people like Thai food? You know, usually all the hands go up. So both of those would be a majority preferred choice. And if we were voting on, you know, what should we eat for dinner, either of them would be a majority winner. So in that type of scenario, we want to look at not only which candidate has a majority, but which majority is stronger. So back to your question, in star voting elects a majority preferred winner between the 2 highest scoring candidates. Ranked choice elects the majority preferred winner of all remaining ballots, but some ballots are exhausted ballots. So voters whose other choices were gone already, their vote wasn't able to transfer, that's called an exhausted ballot, and those ballots end up in the discard pile, and they don't count, they're literally not counted in the deciding round. Do you think that answered your question? I see actually another. In IRV, wouldn't we have to choose which we liked better, tacos or Thai? No way they could result in multiple possible majorities. Exactly. So that's a good question. So that is a big difference between instant runoff and star. If I liked Thai food and tacos equally, I would have to like arbitrarily pick one to be first and one to be second. Whereas in STAR, I could say I like them both equally. So that can skew results. It could be random which one we pick if we actually don't have a preference. And most people do have a strong preference for first choice and second choice and third choice. But in big fields of candidates, do you prefer your 13th or your 14th choice? That's often a lot more nebulous.
And I'll quickly add, there's a huge problem with what are called near tie misses, or sorry, near tie nightmares with ranked choice voting, and that happen quite often, where it's like you really don't know who was actually supposed to win, and part of it comes down to like this arbitrary like people being forced to choose between options that they actually feel are equal. And like this is a problem that you can run into in real life that can cause a lot of like tension in the political space in your country after elections. So yeah, it's not necessarily desirable to force people to decide between two things that they feel the same about.
Right, yeah, and ties in ranked choice voting can happen in every round, so that makes them a lot more likely than our current system. STAR voting, because it's got the more expressive ballot, ties are about 10 times less likely to happen. So just to breeze through the rest of this chart here, can ballots be tabulated locally? That's something that we mostly take for granted, our current system. You can take any subset of ballots, you can take the early returns, count them. You don't need to have all the ballots in one place or at one time to be able to tabulate the election. But with ranked choice, you do need to have all the ballots centrally located. And you can't start counting them until all the ballots are received. So you need to know you need to look at all the ballots before you know who to eliminate. And if you were to go through the various rounds of tabulation and then find some more ballots, turns out somebody's got some in their van, you wouldn't be able to tally those without starting over. So that can create real logistical issues in terms of chain of custody. If you're trucking all the ballots to a central location, which is what they do in the state of Maine now, you have to trust the people who are physically moving them. If you're sending that ballot data electronically, again, anytime you're sending election data over the internet, that's not ideal or secure. But all voting systems, pretty much almost all, besides instant runoff, ranked choice, pass that criteria.
While we're on the subject of tabulation, real quick, we got another question.
Sure.
Can you explain the process again for STAR voting after the first round? How is the winner decided between top two?
Yeah, so the two highest scoring candidates are finalists, and then you just take each ballot and you look at it, and here I've got a stack of ballots on these handouts here. So I would just sort them and I'd say, oh, this one prefers candidate A, this one prefers candidate B, and then whichever candidate was scored higher on that ballot gets that vote. And then you'll have a couple ballots that maybe are no preference between those two, put those in the middle pile. So each ballot is one vote for one or the other, or neither.
I'll add one quick thing. I think something a lot of people don't realize is that still currently in the United States, and for a lot of good reasons, every single ballot in the United States for every election is inked on paper. It's a physical ballot. So like when she's doing those props, like that's how physical ballots are counted in like recounts or in small jurisdictions where they don't have electronic counting machines. So it's very real and very physical, that process.
Yeah, and I mean, STAR voting obviously can be counted using an electronic vote tabulator, can be counted using the exact same machinery that we use now, essentially a scanner, optical, which bubbles filled in. It's just a simple software upgrade. So really it's like Scantron level technology that we've all been doing since we were kids. And there's a little foreshadowing of my next slide. But yeah, in terms of tabulation complexity, our current system is obviously extremely simple. You're just adding up 1 vote, 2 vote, 3 vote. But it's so simplistic and it's not really very representative that we usually use a 2-round system. So we need a primary and then a general election. And that is not as simple as possible for voters or for candidates to run a year-long election for, you know, a local office. It's a big deal. Ranked choice has multiple rounds. Approval voting is really the simplest because you do get really good results from just 1 round of tallying. And it is just a simple tally, you add up the votes. Score voting, also just basic addition, 1 round. And star voting is still pretty simple. You're just adding up the scores in the scoring round, and then you're adding up the number of votes in that second round. And then these next statistics come from the chart that I'm about to show you, but we can actually simulate voting method accuracy, how representative the outcomes are across all sorts of different scenarios, like whether voters are strategic or not, how many candidates there are, different scenarios. So in general, our current system is only accurate between 72 and 86% of the time. So around a quarter of the time, we're gonna have non-representative winners that really didn't deserve to win if we had all the data. Ranked choice is better in the 80 to 91% range. Approval voting's better than that again in the 84 to 95% range. Score voting, 84% to 97%. And star voting is 91% to 98% accurate. And this is according to voter satisfaction efficiency. So I'm gonna skip ahead to my next slide. Here's a chart from voter satisfaction efficiency. And this is a study done by Jameson Quinn at Harvard. He got his PhD in statistics there. And voter satisfaction efficiency is defined as, is a voting method going to pick the correct winner, and how often? So the correct winner is defined as the, let's see, 100% would mean that an impossibly perfect method would always elect the candidate who would make as many voters as possible, as satisfied as possible with the winner. So, and you see different strategies color coded here, with red being like 100% of voters are strategic. Everyone's voting lesser evil if they have a lesser evil. Nobody's voting their conscience. On the other side, we've got 100% honest voters who are like, I don't care what everyone else is doing, this is what I think. And you see star voting's got this blue dot out in the front of the pack. And what that means is that we get our best outcomes in star voting when voters are honest. And contrasting that to plurality voting, in plurality in our current system, we get our best outcomes as a country if voters are totally strategic. So strategic voting is really strongly incentivized. And you see that same thing broken down as a ratio of strategy resistance factor. So how often is strategic voting going to help you, and how often is it going to hurt you as a voter? With our current system, it's 17 to 1. If you can be strategic, you really should. Ranked choice and approval are almost the same, 2.7 and 2.6 respectively to 1. Score voting's 3.3 to 1. Star voting has a 1-to-1 ratio. So voting strategically might help you or it might backfire about the same amount of the time. It's not incentivized. So eliminating strategic voting, it's been definitively proven that you can't eliminate strategic incentives in every single scenario for all voters, but what you can do is make it less incentivized. So for instance, like a game of chess, highly strategic. You really need to be strategic to win, versus a game of dice. It's not really going to do you much good. And Sass, you look like you want to say something there. Am I misunderstanding?
Yeah, no, I have 1,000 thoughts going through my head. I really love this idea that like that star voting actively incentivizes honesty, which is like at least, and correct me, and maybe I'm wrong, but not very many voting systems actively incentivize honesty.
Right. So that's this next chart. So we've got strategy. Let's see, I've got all my little Zoom things blocking my graphics, so I can't quite see it when I'm showing it to you. But if I move those around, yeah, on the top left, we've got strategy backfires. On the bottom right, we've got strategy works. You don't want strategy to work. That means the system's gameable. So our current system's on this bottom worst end of the spectrum. As we head this way, we run into score voting, instant runoff. Approval is over there in that orange dot section, I think. Somewhere in that neighborhood. Star voting is green. And then up in this top left corner, you've got some maybe less obscure, but very strategy resistant, or more obscure and more strategy resistant systems. So star voting's not the best in the world at this. Some of the Condorcet systems do really well. And what Condorcet is a whole nother family of voting methods that use a ranked ballot, but instead of doing elimination style rounds, they actually count all the ranking data. So those systems tend to get results somewhat on par with star voting, but it can be very complex to tally it, because the way that that works is you're looking at like pairwise combinations between every set of candidates. So historically, they haven't really been seen as like a viable option. But yeah, there's tons of voting methods out there. What we see across all of these statistical models, regardless who's doing the study, what voting method they prefer, plurality consistently comes in worst, our current system. And then generally instant runoff is near the bottom of the list. It's usually not in the top 10 systems considered. So when we're looking at this talking point that, oh, it's been around for a long time, it's got a wealth of data behind it, this is what everyone else is doing, shouldn't we just jump on the bandwagon? That's kind of bandwagon logical fallacy, because we do have 150 years of data showing that this is a voting system that has problematic outcomes, that has implicit biases, that has wonky, weird tabulation complexity, and that behaves in really confusing and sometimes counterintuitive ways. So SAS had specifically requested these wonky diagrams. And so I added them to the presentation last minute. I don't have them all fully labeled, so you'll have to bear with me. But this researcher in Berkeley, Kapi Yang, in I think 2003 or 6?
2006.
2006, he came up with a system for visualizing voting method accuracy. And the way that it works is you've got this two-dimensional plane. Each candidate is a colored dot. So we've got like a red candidate, a yellow candidate, a blue candidate, and a green candidate. And ideally, the the space, the background represents like voters, and voters who are closest to their candidate prefer that candidate. So, so the way we look at these, and I'm not fantastic at explaining them, but generally each colored dot should be surrounded by a background of their color. If they don't have their own background behind them, that means that they're getting screwed by the system. And they're really getting a deeply unfair shake of things. So in the first top graphic, we see green is having the spoiler effect happen to them. They're kind of too close to red, and they end up losing even when voters prefer them. Even if the center of public opinion is like exactly centered on that candidate, they would still lose in this scenario with plurality voting. Approval voting gives really good outcomes there. The green one, the green dot has a green area around them. They would win as long as the center of public opinion is in their region. And then this third graphic on the top row is instant runoff. So ranked choice voting. And what you see is this really 80s shape, really disco sort of weird light show shape. And what that is like distortion from some people's votes transferring, other people's votes not transferring. And it's really visualized in a pretty jarring sort of a way. So on the bottom row, we've got another example. We've got plurality on the left. And again, in this one, we see that this red candidate has like a very diminished win region, even if voters are like really coalescing around them, they would probably lose. The second one is instant runoff voting. And that's showing, again, like a super weird, distorted shape for their win region. The third one is score voting. And it's actually showing a center expansion effect here, where red is getting like, red is in the middle of these other candidates, and they're actually getting a bigger win region than they deserve. As an advantage of being in that center position. And then this last one is star voting, and it's kind of got a nice win region for each. So these Y diagrams are interesting because they actually predicted the invention of star voting. Over a decade before star voting was invented, the system that tested the best in these simulations was a score voting primary and a top 2 general election. And star voting is that exact same thing, but all lumped into one. So let's see here. My little slide controller disappears if I'm not hovering over it. Yeah, any questions about these Y diagrams, or Sass, is there anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, there are no questions so far. I will say, these are a little bit easier to understand when they're animated, and the Equal Vote Coalition actually has a video showing them animated and explaining it more in depth. So I just put that, it's just on YouTube. I just put that in the chat if you guys want to open that tab and take a look at it later. The reason that I had asked specifically that Sarah include these is particularly with plurality voting and instant runoff or ranked choice voting, which are the two on the bottom left, we can see how like the colors just don't line up. The idea here is that if you were to simulate like actually having voters within this political space, like think you've seen, literally think of it as like a 2-dimensional, like you're scoring like, I don't know, like economics on one axis and like authoritarianism on another axis or whatever it is. And these candidates, these dots exist in that space. And then you have, basically you're trying to find what she said earlier, the center of public opinion. And whenever you place it somewhere, whichever candidate would end up getting elected, you color that point the color of the candidate who wins. So ideally, you would have these really nice, perfect, like convex polygons with lines that go exactly halfway in between every single candidate. If you had that infinite voter expression precision that she was talking about earlier, which does not exist. And so the whole idea is to create a system where you get as close to that kind of perfect, it's called the Voronoi diagram, as possible. And in terms of like a simple to understand single round, single winner election, star voting just comes above the rest. We do have a question from Dick Moore. How does star voting rate when you have primaries as well as main elections like we have in the USA?
So across the board, if you have a primary and a general election, that's going to get you a more representative outcome than just the one election alone in terms of data. But if you take into account some other real world factors, primaries also have some real downsides. So for candidates, having a primary and then a general election means that their campaign season is twice as long. So their campaign budget needs to be twice as big, and they maybe need to quit their day job because this is going to take a while. So it has some real like access and inclusion issues that come up when you have this like long, expensive, drawn out process. Another factor that comes into play with primaries is that generally across the board, primaries have higher voter turnout of a specific demographic, and that's like voters who are generally older, whiter, and more conservative. So a primary will almost always have a bit of a more conservative bias than a general election, which has higher turnout and thus is more representative. So those are the downsides of a primary. Primaries in general, regardless of voting systems, do have advantages of narrowing the field. That's obviously why we do it. So voters and humans in general, there's something called cognitive load, where if we have, where we can really only hold a distinct number of separate concepts or ideas or candidates in our memory, in our mind at a time. If we have too many at a time, we get overwhelmed, we get bogged down, we get confused. So cognitive load theory generally shows that humans like to have some choice and some variety up to like 5 to 7 options, but beyond that, we can get overwhelmed. So that is a pretty good case for not having, ideally, more than like 7, 8 candidates in an election. And anytime we have more than that, you're going to get some drop off. Voters aren't going to learn about all the candidates. They might not have as an informed an opinion about every single one. So you can take that factor and kind of balance it. Primaries have some pros and cons. A lot of people are anti-primary in terms of reform space. And I tend to agree. But star voting can be used with or without a primary. If you are going to have a primary, you should definitely have a star voting primary, or at least a better voting primary than choose one. Because again, choose one elections are just really catastrophically awful when there's huge fields of candidates. But yeah, so yeah, definitely. Our proposals in Oregon, we have 3 ballot initiatives for star voting in Troutdale, Lane County, and Eugene currently. And all 3 would eliminate the primary and just have one nonpartisan general election using star. So that's how we would recommend doing it across the board, unless there's some reason you can't. Obviously, we can't eliminate the presidential primary. No matter what state we live in, that's just not really doable. So in that case, we'd say have a star voting primary. Each party could use star voting. And in fact, the Independent Party of Oregon used star voting for their primary last year. Yeah. So that's the Yee diagrams. This chart kind of brings us back home to those original 5 criteria that were set out by the Equal Vote Coalition: simple, honest, expressive, accurate, and equal. So in the equal category, we've got score voting, approval voting, and star voting all deliver an equally weighted vote. Approval voting, choose one voting are both very simple. Star voting is pretty simple. Score voting's still pretty simple. Condorcet methods, really not that simple. Instant runoff, ranked choice voting, not simple at all, especially if you're getting into the details of it. Yeah. And then, sorry about that. So for the People's Party, this presentation, I'm just going to assume that you guys fall in the camp of not feeling fantastically represented by the 2-party system, wishing that there was, that we could break through the duopoly and have new parties emerge, new parties become viable, 3rd-party candidates be taken seriously. And what that is gonna take in terms of the real world, in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, but we're not gonna be able to break through the 2-party system while we have choose one plurality voting. It's the one systemic designed in thing that is just locking it into, it's only accurate with 2 candidates, it's us against them. The system's just designed to pit us against each other. So for 3rd parties, I absolutely recommend making voting reform your top priority, making it the first thing that you accomplish, ideally before even running candidates under that party label. For 3rd parties to be effective under the 2-party system, with choose one only voting, there's a pretty limited set of scenarios where that's ever historically been viable or been effective. Bernie Sanders is often quoted as like, well, he's an independent, how did he do it? Well, he caucuses with the Democrats. So even though he's got that independent party label in Vermont, they allow him to run against the Democrats in a Democratic caucus for the first round, and then advance to the general election without another Democrat against him. So it becomes him versus the Republican. And that's how he's able to win in Vermont, which is a pretty blue state. Other 3rd parties that have had major success within the 2-party system, there's the Tea Party. And they did it by saying, hey, we're a new party, but we're running as Republicans. So they weren't really Republicans, but by running under the Republican ticket, it again allowed them to leverage that primary system to eliminate everyone on their side. They targeted races in non-swing states. So if they did win the primary, they would be almost guaranteed to win the general election. And that was super effective. In 2016, a bunch of Bernie Sanders strategists came up with the Indivisible Guide, which recommended doing the exact same thing on the left. And they ran a bunch of candidates, AOC being the most famous. And that was her exact strategy for winning. She ran basically on a Green Party platform, but she ran as a Democrat. She won her primary, and that allowed her to go into the general election almost unopposed. So unless third parties want to do that thing where they're like, oh, I'm gonna coalition with a major party, or do this inside strategy and fight from within the Democratic Party or within the Republican Party, they tend to get squashed. And it is, there's something called Duveringer's Law. Sass, do you know if I'm pronouncing that wrong?
I have no idea.
But this is a political science concept that's been basically proven that choose one voting in the world, wherever it's used, leads to two-party domination. So it really is encoded in the voting method itself. And if we want to break past it, we need better voting. So absolutely, I recommend getting rid of choose one voting. If you prefer approval voting, that's great. I see it as a really good system, although I want to be able to show my favorite. If you prefer instant runoff voting or ranked choice, you really like ranking things, I totally get it. I like being able to show my preference order, but you do want your full vote to count. So you might as well just upgrade to STAR, the best of both worlds. And I think on that note, that is my full monologue for you guys.
Awesome. I want to say thank you to Sarah. First off, really appreciate you putting this together and taking my special request and putting in the time. I don't know what your schedule is like. I know we started late. We're already about 15 after 8. Are you okay to stick around, or do you need to get going?
No, I'm here until we're done. If you wanted to open up some discussion, either with you or with other people, I'd be happy to go into more depth on anything. One thing I didn't really cover is STAR voting. Where are we at in the world today? So in the last 4 years, STAR voting's gone from being basically unheard of to having a real claim in the voting reform community. So among people who have looked into voting methods, who have heard, oh, wow, there's more than one. What do I think of these? A lot of those people have come on board with STAR voting, and we have a really, really active volunteer base. So all of our resources, materials, projects, committees, all of that's pretty well volunteer run. We have chapters all around the country. Some of them more established than others, but definitely activists all around the country and in Canada as well. So if you want to do voting reform, if you want to launch a campaign or launch a bill, we just put in a bill proposal for the Oregon legislature this week. And Utah is actually doing the same thing or similar. They've got a bill for STAR voting and approval voting that they're working on that would allow jurisdictions to pilot either. So yeah, if you're interested in going this route, we're here to help. We have resources and people that can get that off the ground and running.
Awesome. I just threw the site for the Equal Vote Coalition for STAR voting in the chat, starvoting.us. We have 3 questions lined up. Awesome. So we have from Ivan, does STAR have a system for electing, for example, 3 people out of a slate instead of 1?
Yeah, great question. So STAR voting can be used for single winner elections. That's what I was describing so far, but you can absolutely use it for multi-winner as well. And there's 2 ways to do multi-winner elections. You can do basic multi-winner, or otherwise known as multi-winner block, where you're taking like the top 3 candidates. And the way that would work is you score the candidates, you find the 2 highest scoring, you do a runoff, the finalist preferred by the majority wins the first seat. Then you take the next 2 highest scoring candidates, which one of those was preferred by a majority, they win the second seat. Then you take the next 2 highest scoring, the one that was preferred wins the third seat. And yeah, so that's multi-winner block STAR voting. It's great for finding a set of candidates who are the most popular. It's great for primaries. advancing like the top 5 most popular candidates to the general election. And the other way to do it is proportional representation. So for any of these ballot types, whether it be choose one only, 5-star, or ranked ballots, you can do proportional representation. And the way that works is kind of like a parliamentary system, where if my faction has 25% of the voters, I would win 1 out of 4 seats up for election. So you get each ideological faction getting representation at the table. And proportional representation is really fantastic for bodies that want to prioritize diversity of representation, which is not the same as diverse candidates, but ideological diversity. And proportional, for the United States, switching to proportional representation would be a much bigger lift because we don't have a parliamentary system. To do that on a national level would be like a constitutional amendment. But for local organizations, and particularly like grassroots organizations, it could be a really cool experiment, or a really cool option to experiment with and try out.
Awesome. And the next question is closely related. I don't know if it's going to add anything, but from Gabriel, what are your thoughts on multi-member districts and how that would affect how star voting or other voting methods would work?
Yeah, that's another great question. So the simplest type of district is a single winner district, and you have one for each geographical region. And single winner districts ensure that you get really good geographical representation. So people on the north side of the tracks are represented, people on the south side of the tracks are represented, and everyone has the shortest distance to go to find their one representative and hold them accountable. So a lot of people really love single winner districts for all of those reasons. But there's some disadvantages as well. Single winner districts are, in America, often totally gerrymandered. And gerrymandering obviously sucks, whether it be a political gerrymander or a racial gerrymander. The Supreme Court has ruled you're not allowed to do a racial gerrymander and make it so that people of color can't get elected, but you are totally allowed to do a political gerrymander. So a lot of people propose multi-member districts to try and mitigate that. And it is an effective way to mitigate that, but you also can mitigate it by asking or by mandating that political districts be drawn up using something called efficiency gap, which actually measures how many votes on each side are being wasted. And those numbers should be about fair. So if the districting and the way that you're drawing the lines is favoring one party over the other, you can say, oh, we got some gerrymandering, we should redraw that until it's more fair. And that can be measured mathematically, so it should be measured mathematically, in my opinion. But aside from gerrymandering, multi-member districts have another advantage in that if me and Sass were running against each other, and we're in the same multi-member district, or if we're in the same single winner district, you can only have one of us. But if we're in a multi-member district, we could win both seats if you like us both. So you can end up with like great candidates running against each other, and then one of them loses, but then kind of lamer candidates end up winning without a great challenger to oppose them. So that's one factor. And
I
then
would love-
definitely if you're doing a multi-winner method or proportional, then you need to have a multi-member district.
I would love to serve side by side with you, Sarah. That would be amazing.
Me too.
From Mark, we have how many petition signatures are needed to get STAR voting as an Oregon state ballot initiative?
Ooh, statewide, I don't have that number off the top of my head. Somewhere in the like 100,000 plus range. It's definitely a lot. It definitely would require some major funding and tackling COVID first. So our biggest barrier right now to in-person canvassing is that it's dangerous to talk to people face to face and pass things back and forth and touch things. But definitely what we're trying to do right now is build the grassroots infrastructure around the state in Oregon that we would be able to collect those signatures effectively down the line. And what we just did was we actually have a legislator in the House of Representatives that's introducing a bill to adopt STAR voting. So the easiest way is always for the politicians to just do it. The harder way is for us as individuals to use the ballot initiative. But if that's what we have to do, that is what we will do.
No more questions from anybody else, but that actually leads into a question I want to ask, which is STAR voting compared to other alternative systems, the legal viability across the states. Every state has a different election code,
Right.
And I'm wondering, I think it's good for everybody to hear about about its compatibility with currently existing election codes and how easily we would be able to get it across the states implemented at various levels.
Yeah. So like you said, every state is different. Oregon, where I live, we're really lucky. Our election code and state charter was revised like 100 years ago to legalize alternative voting fully. And we don't have any issues. We can do whatever we want. But in Texas, I know they passed a law banning preference voting, which at the time was the official name of instant runoff voting. So instant runoff voting is not legal in Texas currently. STAR voting and approval voting probably could be done in Texas. In Maine has gotten a lot of press for having adopted ranked choice voting statewide. But for those of you who might not have been following the play-by-play, what they did is they passed it statewide and then it was ruled unconstitutional. And they challenged and they were ultimately able to get it used for federal offices in Maine, but not statewide. And they're still battling that out in the courts. So in Maine, there's language that winners are found by plurality, and that's pretty common wording. And a plurality voting winner means you don't need to find a majority winner. It's just whoever has the most votes. So ranked choice voting, the way it's counted is you count the first choice votes, you find a plurality winner. So according to the Maine Constitution, that should be the ultimate winner. But then in ranked choice, you're like, no, we want to recount and then find another plurality winner and then recount and then find another plurality winner. And the line of like, which round do you stop at versus which round is the deciding round is a little bit fuzzy. Again, like I said, they define it as a majority winner, but it's not necessarily a majority because a majority doesn't always exist. And that might not be an actual majority of ballots. So I don't think Maine has a fantastic case constitutionally there. I wish them luck. They've put in years and years So hopefully they do get a good ruling, but it's an uphill battle. And then another state I know of, Washington has statewide law requiring a top 2 general election. So that has made it so that ranked choice voting hasn't been able to get passed, but you could do like what approval voting, you could do what St. Louis just did. They passed approval voting in the primary with a top 2 general election. That would be legal in Washington. You could do a star voting primary and a top 2 general election. Or you could argue legally that star voting is a top 2 general election included. So star voting may well be able to fight that battle and say, we are finding a majority preferred winner between the top 2, exactly like a top 2 general election. And so it should be legal. But that'd be up for a lawyer to battle out. Having read it, I think there's a case.
And just continuing on the discussion of like legal viability, one person, one vote is something that I think when people hear it, they'll be like, oh yeah, how does that apply? So just how does one person, one vote interact with star voting as well as with other voting systems we've been looking at today?
Yeah, so one person, one vote has been defined as the weight and worth of every citizen's vote as near as is practicable must be equal or should be equal. That's a almost perfect quote. And that was codified by the Supreme Court in a case on gerrymandering. But, and in gerrymandering, a perfectly equal vote isn't always possible. It's always going to be changing as the population moves around. But in voting, an equally weighted vote is absolutely possible. And not only that, but our current system doesn't deliver an equally weighted vote. Like I said, all the way back in slide 2 or 3, the more voters you have on your side, your vote is mathematically less strong. And so there is a legal case to be argued that our current system should be illegal now that the world has proven that there are equal voting methods out there. Voting methods that pass this equally weighted vote criterion are star voting, score voting, approval voting, any voting method that uses all the ballot data that allows voters to give an equal rating or ranking should pass that criteria.
So are you implying that ranked choice voting could be shot down in the Supreme Court nationwide at any point in time?
I'm not a lawyer, but
okay,
yes,
fair enough.
But yes, that is a case that could be made, and yeah, absolutely. And especially because some ballots aren't counted, some rankings aren't counted. Instant runoff has a lot of different ways that disenfranchise certain voters over others, or just kind of plays favorites in the details. And so even more than our current system, I think it's really runs a risk of being challenged and repealed for that reason. And if that were to happen, it would be a bad thing. It would definitely hurt the voting reform movement in general. It'd be a bait and switch where people were like, hey, I was told this was more fair. I didn't look under the hood. And now you're telling me all this. I think one thing that we're facing as a voting reform movement is that historically, for a long time, ranked choice voting and the instant runoff voting was like really the only proposal in the game in the United States. And so advocates for it kind of rounded up in terms of their claims. People were very much like, compared to the current system, it totally eliminates spoilers. And at the time, that maybe made sense. But when you compare it to more high level, more modern voting methods, a lot of those claims really don't go as far as they seemed like they had gone, don't fully fact check. And a lot of instant runoff people, particularly Fair Vote, which is the leading organization funding voting reform, they've really doubled down on a lot of claims that are just blatantly false. So for me, as an activist, and maybe for some of you, the talking points that I first heard from a guy with a clipboard, and I was out in my garden, he was like, hey, have you heard of ranked choice voting? And I was like, let me put down my shovel, and that sounds interesting. He was like, here's how it works. It eliminates the spoiler effect. If your first choice is eliminated, your next choice is counted. And so your vote is never wasted. And I was like, wow, that sounds amazing. But later, years later, when I fact checked him beyond the Fair Vote website, I found out all those claims were false. Like definitively, verifiably false. Your vote doesn't always transfer. Sometimes your vote is wasted. It's not necessarily safe to vote your conscience. Your vote can backfire and be worse than if you hadn't voted at all in competitive elections with lots of candidates. So his point that he was trying to make was like, hey, this is way better than the current system. That was true. But the way that it was delivered, super problematic in the long run for the movement.
We have another question. Are any state constitutions being amended to allow star voting?
No, not that I know of. And again, like state of Maine, star voting would already be legal. Star voting does find a plurality winner. It's just whoever has the more, whichever finalist is preferred by more voters wins. We don't guarantee that that person has more than 50% of the votes total. Some people may have no preference. There may not be a majority. So the top two general election is the only one where like maybe we need to amend that for star voting, but we might also not need to. And that's, yeah, up for legal debate.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Sarah. Again, really appreciate you putting in the time, sticking around late. Thanks to everybody else. We haven't really had any real amount of participant drop-offs. That means you guys have been sticking around, which is amazing. We've gone over so much information today. So totally get if it doesn't all stick in your head right now, that's absolutely fine. There are a ton of resources on the starvoting.us site. Again, you'll find that in the chat. There's actually another event coming up soon for that Equal Vote Coalition is doing. So I just posted the Facebook events page for the Equal Vote Coalition. So you can check that out. It's on like Thursday evening, if that's the thing you want to attend. But I don't see any other questions. So I'll let folks all get back to their evening. But unless, Sarah, did you have anything else you wanted to add?
Awesome. No, just definitely encourage you all to get involved with star voting, starvoting.us, get involved with your local voting reform movement. If you have one, or start one if you don't. There's a ton of resources on our website about how to do that. The event this Thursday is 7:30 Western Pacific time. And it's going to be a deep dive comparing star voting and ranked choice voting. So look forward to seeing you all out in the world fighting for better, more equal voting.
All right, thank you so much, everybody. Hey, there's one more. Yep, just a thank you to Sarah. All right, have a nice evening.
Awesome. Thanks, Sass. Cheers.